Okay, we're now on to our final session of the day, which will be a panel discussion covering the growing podcast space in sport. They'll discuss the opportunity this presents for brands and advertisers who want to buy into that special engagement with listeners that they have with podcasts. Please welcome Sophie Hind, Managing Director of the Sports Social Podcast Network, Chris Scull, host of the Quickly Kevin Will He Score podcast and the newly launched Let's Be Having You, and John Gibbons, host of the Anfield Wrap.
Thank you, Matt, and hello, everybody. I'm Sophie, as Matt said, from Sports Social, and we've been talking for a while about the pod boom, the unstoppable rise of podcasting. Latest figures show that there are approximately 464 million podcast listeners around the world, so that's about 40% of people in most markets. Podcast advertising is also in rapid growth. In the UK last year, advertising spend in podcasts grew 23%. But what is less talked about until now is the growth of sport podcasting, a really appealing content channel for sports fans where they can find expert but also passionate debate on whichever sport they love, no matter how niche. So if radio is broadcasting, podcast can be narrowcasting. This offers a great tool for advertisers and brands to reach super engaged audiences, particularly with the summer of sport that Matt mentioned at the start of today. We've got the Euros starting a week on Friday. We've got the Tour de France. We've got the T20 World Cup. We've got the Olympics. There's so much opportunity. And last year, sport became the most sought-after advertising category. So the number one spend was in sport podcasts in the US, overtaking news and comedy for the first time. And that's for a very good reason. So today, we're going to explore some of that reasoning with two experts in the field of sport podcasting, both hosts of incredibly successful shows, Chris, more than one show, but also, as well as being experts in building audiences, they're also expert at putting together super effective delivery for the commercial advertisers that work with their shows. So I'm delighted to welcome Chris and John. I'll let them introduce themselves. So Chris, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, Chris Scull. I host a few podcasts, one about football in the 90s called Quickly Kevin, and a new one about football in the noughties called Let's Be Having You. I also do the official West Ham podcast, Ironcast, and a history podcast called Oh What a Time. And I frequently come up against John at award ceremonies and lose. So.
Well, we have a very rabid community, which we'll come on to, who really come out for us on these sorts of things. Yeah, I'm John Gibbons from the Anfield Wrap. It's Liverpool FC podcast and YouTube channel.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to start with you, John. As on our network at Sports Social, we have two types of podcasts, really: official rights holder content, like Ironcast. We also have what we call fancasts. Particularly in football, there's a huge market for fan-led football podcasts. So fancasts can allow advertisers to get really close to a sports team, particularly in your case, and its fans without going to the expense of having to be an official club partner or sponsor. Pitch-side advertiser, shirt sponsor can cost a fortune. So I was interested in how you've experienced this. So have you had advertisers that have sought access to fans via your content channels ahead of what they could do directly with Liverpool FC?
Yeah, we have experienced that, and it's been interesting. And one brand in particular, it's interesting to talk about, is Erdinger, who make wheat beer in Germany. And lots of people will have heard of Erdinger, but it's actually still a family-run business. And compared to the huge brands like Heineken and Budweiser who sponsor the Champions League, they're actually sort of quite small and, haven't necessarily got the marketing budget to sort of do that. So how they've reacted, because they still want to be involved in football, is well, one thing they did is partner with Jurgen Klopp, who was till last week Liverpool manager, and then after that they were like, well, what can we do now? And then they came to us, and we came up with an idea of producing a documentary series on Jurgen Klopp, but told by supporters, told through supporters both in Germany and in the UK, and we produced something really effective together that value-wise, would have been really difficult for them to do, certainly with a football club, and both of us got huge amounts from it, because for us, having a brand involved just meant we could take everything to another level. You know, we're still quite a small company. There's 12 of us working full time, which is okay for you know, a podcast company, but to produce something like this, we didn't necessarily have the budget to do it in the way we wanted. So it was really win-win for everyone. For the audience, they got a superior product. For Erdinger, they went out to hundreds of thousands of Liverpool supporters, and for us, we got to make something in exactly the way we wanted it without necessarily worrying, you know, overly about costs and things like that. So it worked really well, and Erdinger have found, you know, amongst Liverpool supporters now, there's a really strong association with there for them without necessarily, you know, having to like you said, Sophie, go to the huge expense of like a sleeve sponsor or something like that.
That's great. And then Chris, how does that work from an official rights holder point of view? So with your West Ham Ironcast hat on, do you think that clubs, well, first of all, are clubs that aren't in the audio space already, so, you know, rights holders, Premier League clubs that haven't got audio content, are they realising they're leaving money on the table? And those that are, like West Ham, are they utilising that opportunity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, like, I started podcasting. I started doing a West Ham fans podcast called Knees Up by the Brown about 10 years ago. Actually, is there any West Ham fans in?
No.
Silence. Why would there be? We're in Manchester.
You know, it's a sign of it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you
Any
didn't.
Liverpool fans?
Oh, fantastic. Oh, there you go.
So I started doing a West Ham fans podcast and then got into more mainstream kind of podcasts. And then last summer, the club came back to me and said, we want to launch an official podcast. And the reason they did that is our new head of content came from England, where England had a podcast that had been really successful. And they kind of discovered that long-form content allowed you to get much better stories out of players. And the one thing we did, we had quite a successful, I mean, we still lost to John when we come up for awards, when I was doing the unofficial West Ham podcast. The one thing we didn't have was access to first-team players, like tremendous access rights. And so when we launched the official podcast, we were able to get the first-team players, but also legends, use our network. But then the really clever thing they did is we actually announced new signings using the official podcast. So it became a vehicle to have much better, meaningful conversations with fans, and the fans got to know these players. And you can go watch a 10-minute interview with Jared Bowen on Football Focus, and he'll tell you how he played last week, what he's looking forward to next week. But when you get an hour with him, you can talk about how did your dad feel when he got called up for England for the first time. You get a wonderful anecdote about how he cried his eyes out. So it's, as a vehicle, it's become a much better way to kind of demonstrate the personalities of these players. And also, you can use the network. You've got social media channels to put it out. We release on all podcast platforms, but we're also on YouTube and social media. So if you're a football club and you've got all these methods of talking to your fans, going with long-form content in the way that podcasting allows you to, I think it just creates a much better relationship with the fans. And like I say, the fans get to know the players a bit better.
I agree, and I think it allows the conversation to continue after the main event. So a lot of broadcast is focused on the game or the pre-match or the post-match, whereas a podcast has much more longevity and listeners can come in and tap into it at any time, but also get much more in-depth analysis. So I think that's really interesting. And if we think about sport advertising partnerships, so brands that want to buy into badging exercises, and so we'll stick with the Premier League club theme for now. So that could be sticking a logo on a picture of a player. It could be the official club noodle or paint partner, and Man United have both of those things. How does podcasting offer more impact to a brand than that kind of static badging that you could do with the clubs direct? I'll go back to you, John.
Yeah, it is a challenge, first of all, when you start, because you start a podcast, and a lot of podcasts are sort of, you know, ground up. You think, oh, we'll just have a bit of fun, we'll talk amongst our friends about, that might be sport or sort of whatever it is. And then as you grow, you know, advertising sort of comes with it. And then at first, kind of, you know, when someone like Sophie comes and says, oh, we do this host read, it can feel kind of quite strange, really. But we've just tried to have fun with it, and we've really just tried to make it part of the content and make it those reads as engaging as possible. And that's what sort of worked well for us. And when I listen to other podcasts, you can tell the people who you know, feel a little bit sort of uncomfortable with it, and you can tell that the other ones who are like, no, we're going to have fun. And I think for us, we just try and be as authentic as possible. So we only work really with partners who who we understand, who we think fit in well with us, and we're quite lucky. We've got a subscription model as well, so we're not fully sort of reliant on advertising, and that allows us to pick and choose a little bit more. But for us, we try and sort of integrate partners best we can and into what we do, and just have fun with the reads. And one, for example, we do a lot with NordVPN, and we got introduction through Sophie. So Sophie sort of found us that, and NordVPN are great supporters of the podcast industry generally, and for us, there's lots of reasons why football supporters in particular might want to change their virtual location. I'll be slightly careful how I sort of talk here. But there's certain games you can't watch in the UK that you can watch in other parts of the world, and that's where, this sounds like I'm doing an advert now, but
He's off.
I know, but I think that's sort of why they came to us. But we sort of talked about that, but we also had a little bit of fun with it, and so I don't think I'm probably not the only one in the room who got completely hooked to the return of UK Gladiators when it came in, and I watched it with my whole family, and then we do some events abroad, and the idea of missing that. So I talked about, instead of talking about watching certain Premier League games in England, I talked about going over to America and being able to watch UK Gladiators at the same time as my 4-year-old boy and enjoy that moment together. And so we started doing some stuff to that. What was funny was when we went over to America, we were doing these live shows, people were coming over and going, "Oh, have you managed to watch Gladiators?" Which was really funny. And so you're making content that people, if it's enjoyable and it's hopefully quite funny and it's engaging, people don't feel like necessarily they're listening to an advert, even though that they know that they are, and you're not tricking people. You're just making it flow as part of the content, and making it so it's not like, something that they just want to skip through.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I was going to say, you mentioned live as well, and I think it's really important to say that podcasting is many things. It's a content engine, really. It could be audio, it could be video, it could be live, it could be social, and you've just done a big farewell live, I think, for Quickly Kevin.
So we had a final show at Quickly Kevin at the London Palladium, which was just amazing, and the secret guest was Kevin Keegan, and we didn't tell anyone. And the show Quickly Kevin, I don't know if anyone's listened to it, but it was named after Kevin Keegan, so he came on stage and went absolute, the audience went wild, my ears are still ringing. So live is such an important aspect of podcasting, and actually we did that with Ironcast, actually, talking about commercial sponsors. JD Sports really got behind the podcast, and they kept saying to us, do live shows for us. So we've actually been going around the country, not around the country, East London, let me be clear.
A small part of East London.
As we've demonstrated today, there's no point in coming to Manchester. JD Sports. So we would open, in Westfield, we opened the largest JD Sports store in Europe there. We did a live Ironcast show in there. We've had watch-along parties and invited listeners along. So again, it's become, in terms of a commercial partnership, JD Sports has been brilliant for Ironcast and allowed us to explore the live space without us having to pay for it effectively.
And we've heard a lot today, particularly about the power of radio, but also of podcasting and the audiences and the attention levels and the authenticity. As two people that have had a lot of experience and regularly meet your audiences, I asked these two the other day whether they ever get recognised, and they were like, "Oh God, yes!" They get mobbed in the street by their listeners. But what is it about sport podcasting, particularly, that you think makes it a really valuable tool, particularly for advertisers, but because of the audience and the sports fan that engages with it? I'll go back to you, Chris.
I would say, on Quickly Kevin, that artwork about the football in the 90s I did with Josh Widdicombe, we put a little sticker on the front that said really niche. And I think that's what podcasting allows you to do. And sport is relatively niche. It's something you're really interested in. And it allows you to explore that subject in great detail and part of long-form content. And I feel like it just strikes a deeper relationship with the audience. And when we finished Quickly Kevin, we kind of got an outpouring of emails from listeners who just wanted to tell us what it's meant to them over the years. One email from someone said that they used to go to see Wolves with their dad in the early 90s, and we did an episode with Steve Bull. And they said that when his dad was on his deathbed, they sat down and listened to Quickly Kevin together, and they said what a beautiful moment it was, the nostalgia to reflect on that. And you're reading that going, geez, we never imagined that when we started this podcast. But I think it just demonstrates the relationships you can strike up with people, and sport is a great enabler for that, but specifically podcasted and long-form content just seems to work somehow.
Yeah, I'd just add to that sports fans and football fans in particular are used to being part of a community. So if you support a football team, you're part of that community. And so with a sports podcast, you're sort of used to that. So for our audience, they feel like they listen to us and they're part of a sub-community within the wider Liverpool community, really. And that's been great. And, you know, we used to, well, we still do kind of like stage like meetups and say, oh, let's all get together before the game. But now they all just do it on their own and don't even invite us, to be honest with you. It's like, you just sort of, you see them on social media, like, hang on, do you know what I mean? But they're part of that community with you. And then that's also, as well, something, you know, in terms of the brands, the ones that we work with closely, they then come part of that community too. And that's why, listen, you need to be really careful sort of who you choose and not, you know, take the piss, for a want of a better phrase. But I think, you know, there is that opportunity there to become part of that community. And I think for us, what's been really powerful for us is we do surveys with our listeners, and a recent one, it said 57% have a more positive view of the brands that we work with, and I think it was less than 1% are more negative. And that was really pleasing for me, because I thought, well, we're getting the balance right.
Absolutely, and I think the Loud Parade guys were talking earlier about, you know, emotion and the effect it has on your brain. And I guess sport is one of those things where you go through every emotion, whether it's joy, relief.
Yeah. Pretty much one emotion at West Ham.
You know,
depression.
upset. But I think part of that makes it an environment where, you know, people can respond to you as hosts, but also a brand within that environment is tapping into that kind of memory of that person. So looking forward, I guess, do you think that podcasts are now very much part of the mainstream kind of media diet of sports fans, or do you think there's a way to grow?
Shall I take that one?
You take that one.
Almost every football fan I know listens to podcasts now. When I started it, I started like podcasting back in 2013, and I did because there was no other kind of West Ham fan podcast. And what you realise is it's such a low barrier to entry. Like, you can just create a podcast and start it in your bedroom right now. And I think football fans are just crying out for the extra content all the time. And I actually listen to 2 or 3 different West Ham fan podcasts on top of making the official one. It's how sad I am. But I think it demonstrates that there is such a craving for podcasting content and, like I said, exploring niches. And if you have a look at the stats around podcasting growth, it's just going up and up all the time. So it's such an exciting medium to be a part of, and there's so many niches with podcasting that you can explore for me.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I think we've really scratched the surface in this country of what is possible in terms of podcasting. And what's really interesting for me is that how many people who work in different aspects of the media who have found podcasting and enjoy that so much. You know, we were at an event last week where Kirsty Young spoke, and she said, she only listens to podcasts now because she feels like you're listening to a conversation, and she was talking about how much she enjoys making them. And listen, there is room for sort of everyone, but I think, you know, podcasts have really found their place and have really found their part of the media kind of empire, really, and it is exciting to be part of it, as Chris says, and to see where, you know, it continues to develop.
It's an absolute joy. You know, other examples we have, like, you know, the Garrett Thomas Cycling Club on our network, and during the Tour de France, his audience just goes absolutely insane. And it's exciting to sort of see the seasonal peaks and troughs in audience as well. August, obviously, start of the Football League season. Not only will all the football podcasts have huge audiences, but also the fantasy football stuff that we do as well. So it's really exciting. So I think, final thoughts, really, the golden rule of advertising for me is, you know, you need to meet audiences where they are. And when we talk to rights holders and podcasters about creating great sport audio, it's be where your fans are. And I think that this offers a huge opportunity, you know, to grow audiences further, but also lovely opportunity for advertising brands who want to extend what they're doing in other media. So that's it from us. I don't know if there's any questions, or Matt, anything from you?
Thanks very much, Chris. I've forgotten your name.
John.
Sorry, John.
Don't worry about it.
Round of applause for these guys. Must be getting tired. It's the end of the morning. Any questions for our panel podcasting, or shall I ask one as well? I mean, Sophie, one thing I was going to ask, obviously Radio Centre, I mentioned this morning, has just expanded its remit to represent all forms of audio provided by commercial radio. And you guys are sort of part of Communicore. So how do you work with Communicore, and do you work with the radio brands as well?
Yes, so I'm an ex-radio person as well, so obviously an advocate. So we are backed by Communicore UK, which has been fantastic for us, as a sort of complementary business to the radio side of the business, podcasting as all radio groups, it lends itself naturally, and it's enabled us to grow really quickly. So we focus very much on sport. That's our thing. So that allows us to talk to different clients to the radio business, all the same. There's a lot of synergy, so the Communicore commercial guys will work with us on briefs. But in terms of content, on-air content, obviously it doesn't fit with the radio brands. But what we are able to do is leverage that, that amazing audience that Communicore have got to help promote a lot of the podcasters we work with, because our kind of real passion is to help everybody grow audience as well as grow revenue. And having this big community of, we've got 450 podcasts now, and I was listening to Chris's podcast at the weekend, and they mentioned somebody they wanted to have on their podcast, and I said to them this morning, we work with them as well, we can introduce you. So there's lots of guest sharing and opportunities for hosts to work together.
Yeah. Great. A question down here. Stuart.
Hi, Stuart from Radio Today. Fascinated about the difference between a fan podcast and an official podcast for a club, and the kind of editorial impact of that. Can you be as critical of the club if you're making an official podcast, and also in terms of what they will allow to be advertised? I guess an official Liverpool podcast wouldn't let you advertise a VPN, for example. So where are the differences there, and how do you square some of those issues if you come across editorial? You don't want to be seen as a mouthpiece for the club, but clearly you are with an official podcast.
Yeah, I was really nervous. When we started doing the official one, I was really nervous it was going to turn into like Soviet-style propaganda about how West Ham are doing when we're in a relegation battle. Like, everything's great. But actually what I realised you could do, Quickly Kevin is about football nostalgia, and what you can do with West Ham, if you're doing an official podcast, is you can talk about the past where everything's a bit safer. And that's so it's a difficult editorial line to tread, but when you've got you bring on legends and you talk about the good times, and if you to bring on a current first team player, you might mention the fact we're in the middle of a relegation battle and it's a massive disaster, but after 30 seconds then you move on to the good times they've had with the club or the good times they've had in their career. And it's kind of what Gemma Atkinson was saying earlier, about it's about being authentic. So I always push the club, like, we have to acknowledge if things are bad, we have to talk about that for 30 seconds, but then we've got to move on. And I think that's how we've managed to establish a modicum of credibility. But it's a very good question, because it's super difficult, but my advice would be, you've just got to think of the good times and go back to nostalgia where everything's all right, don't talk about the present.
Yeah, and from an advertising and brand perspective, we've got Brighton, Man City, West Ham, Tottenham, Spurs, Celtic, you name it. We've got a lot of official rights holder podcasts on our network. So they all have agreed block lists, because they are, particularly when they first look at putting advertising in their own content, they are nervous about the official club partners. So we kind of work around that with their commercial teams to different degrees, but some of them are a lot more open and flexible than others.
One more thing to add is that a football club obviously has all its own commercial partners. So when we create a new vehicle in Ironcast, that's suddenly a new thing the commercial team can go sell to those partners. So which is why we were able to pick up JD Sports and conversations with Betway and all this stuff. So again, although the commercial department didn't know what to do with the podcast, very soon they saw the kind of potential for it.
Okay, any more questions? I guess a question really for John and for Chris. I mean, presumably these sort of started as a side hustle kind of thing to get going off the ground. Are these full-time jobs now, the businesses you're building based on your podcast? John first?
Yeah, we've got 12 full-time staff, and like you say, it started out as a hobby. We were a group of people who just wanted to get together on a Monday and talk about the club that we loved, and people wanted more, and then we all got offered a radio show by Bauer, and we used to go up the tower. It is real, Gemma, if you're still about. We used to go up there on a Friday and do 5 till 6 on the sadly lost Radio City Talk, and that was a great experience, and what a steep learning curve, but enjoyable learning curve, to do live radio for 5 to 6 on a Friday, and we learned so much about what we're about from there. And then people wanted more, and we were like, well, if you want more, I'm sorry, you'll have to pay for it, because we can't do any more for free. And so that's when we launched a subscription service. We started working with advertisers, came on board with Sports Social last year, and it's been phenomenal for us. So we're 12 full-time staff in Liverpool, and I feel lucky to talk about football for a living, although half the time, obviously, when you run the business, you might as well be selling sofas, because there's like, you know, all the kind of other stuff around it, but I mean, we still feel very fortunate, definitely.
Yeah. And from my perspective, like I've got into podcasting in 2013, and it's been the Wild West, even now, like, over the last 11 years. So I started quickly, Kevin, off the back of the unofficial West Ham, and then did the official West Ham, and started a history podcast, and built a podcast subscription platform, because I identified a bit of a gap. So whereas John has got a nice, stable vision and strategy of the podcasting life he wanted to have, I have built a scattergun mess that I am trying to contain. But it's like I say, it's just such an exciting space, and so much is happening.
Great. Well, look, thanks very much to Sophie, Chris, and John. Thank you very much.
Yeah.